Get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those of you that are joining from the West Coast. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, the sponsor of this program. I want to thank you all for coming to this presentation of American Shtetl, the new book by Nomi, Stolzenberg and Myers that tells the story of the Satmar Hasidic community of Kiryas Joel in upstate New York. And the book investigates Kiryas Joel's complex relationship with mainstream US society and probes urgent questions concerning American law and Jewish culture. So these are important, timely issues, and I'm glad we are able to welcome Professor Stolzenberg and Myers today. This is the last program of the spring semester that we're sponsoring. Many of you are familiar with the activities of our center, but if you're not, if you're new to our events and would like to learn more about the future activities of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center, we're already planning for the fall. We'd love to hear from you. So please email us and we will keep you informed. I'll make sure to put contact information in the chat box in just a moment. As you can see, this talk is being recorded. It will be later uploaded to the YouTube channel of the center. I want to invite you to keep your microphones muted during the talk. After the talk, we will also have plenty of time for questions. We've all become very adept at using Zoom for these kind of programs, so you all know what to do. Please feel free to use whichever function you want. You can use the hand raise function or type the word question in the chat box, and I'll make sure to call you in the order that we receive. And of course, if you're unable to unmute yourself, please type your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud for you. Now, let me introduce our speakers. Nomi Stolzenberg holds the Nathan and Lilly Shapell Chair at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law, where she also co-directs the Center for Law, History, and Culture. She has written widely on law and religion, law and liberalism, law and psychoanalysis, and law and literature. Her publications include "E Drew a Circle That Shut Me Out," Assimilation, Indoctrination, and the Paradox of a Liberal Education in Harvard Law Review, The Profanity of Law in Law and the Sacred, and writing the relationship between race and religion in law in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies. After the publication of American Shtetl, her most recent research focuses on religious accommodation and political theology, and she's currently developing a theory of faith-based discrimination. Myers is professor of history and holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he also directs the Laskin Center for History and Policy. He has written extensively on modern Jewish intellectual and cultural history, particularly influentially on the history of Jewish historiography and its implications. Among his many publications are Reinventing the Jewish Past, European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History, Resisting History, Historicism and its Discontents in German Jewish Thought, Between Jew and Arab, The Lost Voice of Simon Ravidovich, Jewish History, A Very Short Introduction, and The Stakes of History on the Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life. Myers has also edited or co-edited several books, including The Jewish Past Revisited and The Faith of Fallen Jews, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, and the Writing of Jewish History. We're so glad to have you. I think this is going to be a wonderful presentation and discussion. Please join me in welcoming Nomi Stolzenberg and Myers. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Francesca. It's really a delight to be here with you. So our task really is to unpack what we mean by this term American Shtetl, and thus I'm going to begin my presentation. I'm going to upload some slides to allow us to begin that work. Let's see. Okay. Okay. So this is the book that Francesca just mentioned. It's called American Shtetl. And as I said, really the first question we want to take up is why American and why Shtetl? And that's going to be one of the animating issues that will provide continuity throughout this presentation. I want to begin with the second term in the title, Shtetl, a term that conjures up rather familiar scenes, especially the depiction on the left from the iconic Fiddler on the Roof. Shtetl, the plural of shtetls, existed in Eastern Europe, including in the area now occupied by Ukraine, which is very much on our mind. And the image that we see here on the left really suggests a holistic, uniformly traditionalist, homogeneous community, really wedded to a single belief system and way of life. And yet we know that that ideal of the shtetl, the mythic shtetl, wasn't exactly, did not really conform to the historical shtetl as we know it existed in Eastern Europe. So a shtetl, to go back to the very beginning, to the basic definitional premise, is a small town or village in Eastern Europe with a substantial Jewish population. As one of the leading experts of Eastern Europe, Eastern European Jewish history, Sam Kassaw, notes, we shouldn't understand the shtetl as an entirely uniformly Jewish world. Shtetls were indeed often affixed to part of existing towns and cities, and had substantial Jewish populations, but mixed in with a larger non-Jewish population. And in no instance was there officially sanctioned self-regulating government authority accorded to a shtetl in Eastern Europe. Certainly in modern times, in 19th and 20th century times, we can go back and talk about the status of the Council of Four Lands. But when we get to the modern period, the 19th and 20th century, there's no self-regulating, governmentally sanctioned Jewish shtetl. And this really points to one of the recurrent questions that brings Nomi and me together as scholars, our interest in the attempt by Jews and others to assert a strong form of collective or communal identity in the modern world, in the face of all sorts of threats, ranging from totalitarian fascism on one end to liberal assimilationism on the other. And this is what really drew our attention to Kiryas Joel as an example of a strong form of communal identity that, in some sense, swam against the current of modernity. Kiryas Joel, the community, or Kiryas Joel, we'll refer to it as both, as well as KJ, is a phenomenon that we believe could only take rise in the United States, at least in terms of the Jewish diaspora, that is to say, outside of the state of Israel. By that we mean a not just homogeneous, but legally sanctioned community. Kiryas Joel, in many ways, resembles more the mythic ideal of the shtetl, the sort of fiddler on the roof ideal, than it does the actual historical shtetl. And why is that? Well, first of all, because it's legally recognized. It's a legally recognized village, and we'll get to this in a minute, now town in Orange County, New York, with a population of 33,000 people. It is comprised entirely of members of the Satmar Hasidic group who hew to a very distinctive way of life. They value enormously their homogeneity. They value very much their existence as a segregated enclave at a remove from the seductions and allures of the city. And they also have come to appreciate the high degree of self-government, of what we call local sovereignty, that they have been able to gain. It's important to note, and I don't know that we'll have a chance in the presentation, but we'll be happy to talk about it, that Kiryas Joel, which was originally created as a village in the state of New York, in January 2019, also became an officially recognized town. So there's now a village of Kiryas Joel and a town of Palm Tree, the name of which we'll explain in due course. The community exists in Orange County, New York, which is one of the counties north of New York City, about 50 miles. And in fact, Kiryas Joel originally was nestled in the town of Monroe, which is a town in Orange County. The name of the village owes to the charismatic founding Rebbe of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. Joel Teitelbaum descends from one of the most interesting, well-known, and controversial families in what was known as the Hungarian Unterland, that region of the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was itself a fascinating laboratory for the development of what we know of as Haredi, sometimes translated ultra-Orthodox Judaism. The Unterland was a very interesting meeting point between traditionalist currents coming from the east and north and modernizing currents coming from the west. And that confrontation, the confrontation between those competing currents, made the Unterland a really interesting laboratory or incubator for the formation of a project of what we might call it anti-modern modernity that Haredi Judaism represented. That is, say, a decidedly modern phenomenon born of and out of sort of the Enlightenment project, but defining itself very much as anti-modern. And within that incubator, one of the most interesting families to take rise, rabbinic families, was the Teitelbaum family, extending back to the progenitor of the Satmar, of the Teitelbaum Hasidic dynasty, Moshe Teitelbaum, known as the Yismach Moshe, in the early 19th century. The most well-known of the legatees of this Teitelbaum legacy was Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, also known as Reb Yoelish, perhaps best known, especially in this period, around Yom HaAtzmaut, for his books Vayel Moshe from 1959-60 and Al Hagula V'Al HaTmura after the 1967 war in Israel. And I mention this because of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum's fierce anti-Zionism, one of the defining features of his Satmar way. Joel Teitelbaum was also a charismatic Hasidic Rebbe who moved around the Unterland and ultimately settled in what was once the Hungarian city of Satmar, and after the Treaty of Trianon of 1920 was known by its Romanian name, Satu Mare. He didn't arrive there as chief rabbi as rabbi of the city until 1934, and it's only then that he began to really cobble together what would come to be one of the largest Hasidic dynasties in the world today. So his project of sort of gathering together a group of followers into a coherent Hasidic way begins in 1934, and it lasts only 10 years in Europe because in March 1944, Nazi Germany breaks its alliance with Admiral Horthy, the Hungarian leader, invades Hungary, and within 3 to 4 months, nearly 3/4 of the Hungarian Jewish population is deported. For reasons that I can explain, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum is not deported. Rather, he survives as one of the members of the Kastner transport, a train organized by, ironically enough, a Hungarian Zionist official named Rudolf Kastner. Teitelbaum was one of 1,684 Jews who earned a spot on the Kastner transport, which initially made its way to Bergen-Belsen, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, and then to liberation in early December 1944 in Switzerland. After spending 9 months after spending about a half a year in Switzerland, Joel Teitelbaum moved to Palestine, where he had a daughter, and he spent a little under a year there before he made his way in September 1946 to the United States, ostensibly to raise money for his string of institutions back in Jerusalem, but a good number of the Orthodox population in the United States who knew about Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum sought to persuade him to remain in the United States, and in fact, that is what happened. He arrived on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, 1946, and remained in the United States, settling in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Williamsburg, which today continues to be the largest concentration of Satmar Hasidim in the world. Although there was a substantial Orthodox presence in Williamsburg by the time he arrived, Joel Teitelbaum really transformed that community into one that adhered to his norms of stringent piety. This is what would happen when Joel Teitelbaum would come to a community, Karoli, Orshova, Satu Mare. He would bring his very distinctive style of stringent Haredi orthodoxy and demand of his followers the highest level of observance. And the community began to grow in Williamsburg. Within a decade, a community of dozens had become a community of thousands. But already in the early years of his settlement in Williamsburg, Joel Teitelbaum understood that the well-being of the community required another satellite, safe haven, as it were, enclave, outside of the city. That is, a place that could really stand apart from the city, that could be a place of refuge for those tempted by some of those seductions of urban life. And so he instructed his chief aides to undertake a search for a piece of land that could serve as a place of refuge. That was imagined in the Satmar imagination. That was conceived in the Satmar imagination as a shtetl. That was the language used to describe the community that he sought to create. And here it should be noted, and this now touches upon sort of the American part of our title, that his aspiration to create a community outside of the city coincided temporally and conceptually with the large wave of movement, especially of white Americans to the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s. Early attempts were made to find land in Staten Island, in Mount Olive, New Jersey, which elicited a fierce pushback, as you can see in the New York Times article on the right, by town residents and planners who were not especially welcoming of a large group of alien-looking, foreign language-speaking Hasidic Jews. And this became a recurrent problem. Whenever a Satmar representative of Reb Yerlich would show up in a suburban area seeking to buy land, he or they often encountered hostility and resistance. Over time, the Satmars caught on to this, and in the late 60s, early 70s, recruited the brother-in-law of one of Joel Teitelbaum's chief aides to serve as the front man for the operation of purchasing land. The brother-in-law was a clean-shaven, non-observant Jew, the brother-in-law of the person who became the first mayor of Kiryas Joel, a man by the name of Leibush Lefkowitz. Oscar Fisher became the front man in the early 1970s. He made his way to Orange County, New York. In 1972, purchased his first tracts of land in Monroe, New York, and for the next 2 years, a kind of secret project of building a neighborhood intended for Satmar residents within the town of Monroe, but at a remove from other residents of the town, began. And in 1974, the first Satmar residents began to move to this newly established neighborhood of the town of Monroe. When the move began, there was a very brief period of goodwill when Monroe town neighbors welcomed the new arrivals. But shortly after the arrival of the Satmar residents, very substantial contention developed over zoning regulations. What constitutes a single-family home, for example? Is it permissible to have a nursery, a matzah bakery, a ritual bath in the basement of apartment buildings? These debates and contentious disagreements reached the point that both sides threatened the other with litigation, with lawsuits. The Satmars in particular in October 1976, sought to bring a federal religious discrimination lawsuit against town officials and residents of Monroe. And it was really in an effort to forestall the opening of the trial on October 26, 1976, that in a late night meeting on Saturday night, just before that Tuesday, town officials and Satmar officials agreed to carve out of the town of Monroe a village of Kiryas Joel that would have control over its zoning norms. And it turns out to be quite easy in the state of New York to create a village of your own. You can't create a village out of a village, but you can create a village out of a town or a city with the approval of 500 or more inhabitants, and provided that your community is not more than 5 square miles, as you see on the right. So this is a relatively simple operation. And Very few had availed themselves of this legal praxis, but in this state of desperation and seeking to ward off ongoing legal conflict, the two sides agreed to create a self-standing village, such that at that moment, the village was actually formally incorporated in March '77, signed off by then Secretary of State of the State of New York, Mario Cuomo. At that point, the Shtetl, that spiritual enclave had removed, became a legally recognized village according to the laws of the state of New York. In many, many respects, the village has been a stunning success, certainly according to the terms of reference of many within the community. In the first instance, it's been a huge demographic success. So the 1980 census points to 2,000 residents of the community of the newly created village. The population has increased 16-fold since then to 33,000 residents, and estimates are that in 2035 it might be as many as 75,000. Seen from the perspective of Satmar residents, this growth attests to a great success, the great success of the community in attracting and sustaining its native population. It's a homogeneous community, unlike the actual historical Shtetl of yore, but very similar to that mythologized Shtetl. More than 99% of the community are Satmar Hasidic Jews, with a few workers also having residence in the community. According to the 2020 census, 96% of the residents declare that they speak a language other than English at home, which we should assume to be Yiddish, which is the lingua franca of the community, from birth to death, from cradle to grave. Education is extraordinarily important part of life in Kiryas Joel. There is a very rich and extensive network of educational institutions, all of which are private, with one very important exception about which we'll hear a little bit later. It's estimated, according to the 2020 census, 7.5% of the community have bachelor's degrees, and that in all likelihood is a very high number, perhaps not an actual reflection of the number of people who are graduates of accredited four-year institutions. But education is taken extraordinarily seriously, and it is one of the main employers of the community as well. Modesty norms, another hallmark of the Satmar way of life. When you enter the village, you very frequently encounter, depending on where you come in from, you very frequently encounter this sign, as you see on the right, encouraging you to adhere to the norms of modesty and even gender segregation of the community. And this is one of the ways in which the community serves to regulate the norms. Now, this sign, it should be said, is not put up by the official local government, but by semi-official bodies associated with the private religious corporation that preside over matters such as modesty. Another mark of success is the degree of control that the community has over its residents. And you have parallel and often interlacing institutions of authority. You have the religious corporation, the religious congregation, with its own established leadership, at the head of which stands the Rebbe. And then you have the village government. As we'll have an opportunity to discuss, there is indeed substantial overlap between these two bodies of authority. Sovereignty, local sovereignty, although not, we assume, the original aspiration of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, is nonetheless a way in which this community can continue to guarantee its growth through economic incentives, as well as through maintaining a kind of social control over the community. Yet it would be inaccurate to suggest that all was well in the Shtetl. Really, the serious troubles began when the great charismatic founding leader Joel Teitelbaum died in 1979. And really, ever since, there has been an ongoing succession battle. The first iteration of the succession battle, very interestingly, was one that involved the Rebbitzin the widow of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, who had serious difficulties with the anointed successor, her nephew-in-law, Joel Teitelbaum's nephew, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, known as the Bayach Moshe. Moshe Teitelbaum and Feiga Teitelbaum, Alta Feiga as she was known, disliked each other intensely. And very interestingly, a circle of followers of Rabbi Joel surrounded Alta Feiga after the death of her husband. And she became, in some sense, the symbolic and even political leader of this first group of dissidents. There were other circles of enmity that developed, including over the decision to create a public school in this community intended for special needs kids that we will talk about. But perhaps the most well-known source of friction is part of that ongoing succession battle when Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, the second Satmar Rebbe, essentially decided to divide his kingdom, the Satmar kingdom, into two, anointing his third son, Zalman Leib, as the leader of the Satmar community in Williamsburg, and his eldest son, who expected to inherit the entire kingdom, as the chief rabbi of Kiryas Joel, a job that he had actually been in since 1984. Moshe Teitelbaum made this decision in 1999. It shocked the entire Satmar world. It led to ferocious physical, religious, and legal confrontations between the followers of Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum in Kiryas Joel and Rabbi Zalman Leib Teitelbaum in Williamsburg. And yet, by way of conclusion to my section, I want to go back to the original title of the book and offer a kind of a segue to Nomi. And yet, for all the ways in which this community seems to be decidedly Haredi, Jewish, and even foreign to the landscape of the United States, we're very keenly attuned to the fact that strong forms of religious subcommunity have always found a place on the landscape of the United States. Often they have manifested their forms of strong community through what we call bottom-up communitarianism. Not top-down state sanction, but bottom-up purchase of private property, transforming the aggregation of private property into a religious public square. And with that, I think I will hand things off to Nomi. I'll stop my screen share, though we are going to put it up at various points throughout.
Well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. So, as David has said, the Satmar story is an American story as much as it is a Jewish one. And more specifically, it's a story about changes in American society and struggles over the meaning of America's foundational principles that were occurring, or certainly intensifying, just when the village was being formed. So two changes in particular proved to be particularly propitious for the Satmar's separatist project. First, over the course of the 1970s and 80s, America was undergoing a retreat from its commitment to integration. In hindsight, the period in which that commitment was dominant appears to have been short-lived. The 1954 decision of Brown versus Board, in which segregation was denounced, was immediately greeted with widespread resistance, not only from white segregationists and the broader population of white parents who objected to busing and other strategies for desegregating schools, but also from Black nationalists who perceived early on that desegregation would prove to be a hollow hope. By the 1970s, when the Satmar settlement of Monroe was just getting off the ground, the proposition that separate is inherently unequal was being roundly rejected by various groups on the right and the left. A sort of revival of that communitarian sensibility deeply rooted in American history that David left us with. A striking illustration of that sensibility in conservative thought can be found in an address delivered by Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, 1 year after he joined the Supreme Court in 1972, Powell gave an address to what was labeled a congregation of lawyers assembled in San Francisco for a prayer breakfast, where he lamented the loss of traditional values and traditional forms of religious authority and the way that, quote, the shape and style of our lives have been revolutionized by changes beyond our control. And then he went on, interestingly, to explicitly invoke the village of Anatevka, portrayed, these are his words, nostalgically in the film Fiddler on the Roof, which had recently been released, conjuring up the image of, again, Powell's words, Tevye, the father, blessing his family. The Powell address is a vivid illustration of the role the mythic idea of the Shtetl was coming to play in the American political and cultural imagination, embodying, in Powell's words, the sense of belonging and the feeling of individual serenity in the common bond of family life that he concluded, sadly, quote, is not the portrait of contemporary American life. This dovetailed with the second major shift in American culture, the retreat from another core principle of American liberalism, namely the principle of separation between church and state. This, too, it may surprise some people to learn, was a principle of relatively recent vintage. The idea that the Establishment Clause embodies what Jefferson called a wall of separation between religion and state wasn't crystallized in Supreme Court doctrine until the mid-20th century. It was first applied in a 1947 case that held public funding for religious education to be unconstitutional, though that case actually permitted states to subsidize transportation to religious schools. The following year, the court applied the same principle to strike down a public school policy allowing students to be released with their parents' permission to receive religious instruction during the school day from teachers sent in by religious communities inside the public schools. And then, in a pair of decisions in the early 1960s, the court held that the principle prohibits what were then common practices of prayer and devotional Bible reading in public school. Those school prayer decisions sparked a backlash as intense as the resistance to racial desegregation. It mobilized, in particular, both Protestants and Catholics, producing the coalition of evangelicals and conservative Catholics that emerged as a major and highly visible force in American politics, first under the banner of the moral majority in the late 1970s, but which actually was already beginning to be formed in the early 1960s following the school prayer and school funding decisions. That is to say, well before Roe versus Wade. The Christian right's view of the principle of separation between religion and state was clearly stated by none other than William Rehnquist, who, like Powell, became an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court in 1972. In 1985, a year before he became the court's Chief Justice, he wrote a dissenting opinion in a school prayer decision asserting, quote, the wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history, which has proved useless as a guide to judging, and concluding that it, quote, should be frankly and explicitly abandoned. By the early 1990s, it looked like the court might be ready to do just that. And the perfect vehicle for doing that appeared to be a case by the name, maybe we'll get it up on the slide, of Grummett versus Board of Education of the Village of Kiryas Joel, which in 1993, after 3 years of state court litigation, was steaming its way to the United States Supreme Court. You see the cover page of that on the left-hand side of the screen. We can take it down now. That case involved a challenge to the constitutionality of a law enacted by the New York State Legislature permitting the village to establish its own public school district. The motivation behind this law arose from An even earlier legal controversy sparked in 1985 when the Supreme Court handed down a pair of decisions declaring it was unconstitutional to provide state-funded and administered educational services to children in parochial schools. Those cases specifically addressed remedial education services provided to children from low-income and non-English speaking families under Title I, a federal program that was originally launched as part of Johnson's War on Poverty, but their reasoning seemed clearly to extend to programs providing publicly funded and administered services to children with special needs as well. As it turned out, those 1985 decisions represented the apex of the court's commitment to a principle of strict separation between religion and state. Soon thereafter, the court began to retreat from its short-lived commitment to the principle of strict separation, and 12 years later, in 1977, it would reverse those cases, declaring school districts could provide state-funded educational services to students in parochial schools after all. But in 1985, Kiryas Joel needed to find a way to educate children with special needs that did not run afoul of the recent decisions which had declared the opposite. A brief and unhappy experiment with sending Satmar children to the regional public schools had led their parents to conclude that it was psychologically traumatic and inimical to their children's educational interests to be in a culturally alien environment. And in the face of the regional school district's insistence that the children attend the public schools to receive special education rather than receive them at a neutral site, the Satmars appealed to their friends in the legislature to help find a compromise. The idea of creating a separate school district for the Satmars was not the Satmars' idea. In fact, they initially resisted it. It came from a then unknown politician, the former mayor of Peekskill, who had just been elected to his first term as a state assemblyman, George Pataki. From his days as mayor, Pataki was familiar with a proposal to allow small cities to have their own school districts, which had been kicking around state and local government circles for years. That proposal had nothing to do with religion or separatist subgroups, but it nonetheless struck Pataki as a useful way of resolving the conflict between the Satmars and the regional school district, which by that point was as eager to wash its hands of Satmars as the Satmars were eager to be done with it. All the interested parties agreed that it was in everyone's interest for Kiryas Joel to have its own local school district, except for one man by the name of Louis Grummett, who had recently finished a term serving a term as assistant commissioner of New York State's Department of Education, where he was in charge of implementing what was then the new special education law. Grummett, a dyed-in-the-wool liberal who was now running the New York State School Boards Association, was aghast at the prospect of a separate school district for the Satmars and couldn't believe at first that the governor of New York, his longtime mentor and liberal hero, Mario Cuomo, would countenance it. When, in a face-to-face meeting, Cuomo informed him that he not only would sign the bill, but strongly approved of it, Grummett went to court and sued the state and the state education department, claiming that the law violated the Establishment Clause. That litigation, which commenced in 1990, lasted throughout the rest of the decade, as the decision handed down by the Supreme Court in 1994 only marked the midpoint of a legal battle which ultimately resulted in neither a clear repudiation of the wall of separation idea nor in its affirmation. Nor did it result in a conclusive determination of the Kiryas Joel School District's constitutionality, though, thanks to an early ruling from Justice Thomas on what we have now come to refer to as the shadow docket, the school district was permitted to remain in operation pending the outcome of the litigation. And thanks to that shadow docket ruling, From the day the KJ Public School opened its doors in 1990 up until the present, it has never been required to shut down. Now, this may seem surprising, given the much ballyhooed Supreme Court ruling declaring the statute that Governor Cuomo signed into law to be unconstitutional. But that was just the first statute. The grounds on which the court found that statute to be unconstitutional were quite narrow. Rather than hold that it is unconstitutional, a violation of the Establishment Clause, for a religiously homogeneous community to have its own school district, a proposition the court explicitly rejected, the court held that the problem with the first statute was that it singled out one and only one religious community to be the recipient of this considerable privilege. It explicitly stated that there's nothing wrong with having a district serve a religiously homogeneous population, so long as every homogeneous community with a similar need has the same opportunity to have a school district of its own. Following this logic, the New York legislature lost no time in passing a new statute. This new law scrupulously avoided mentioning Kiryas Joel by name, unlike the first one, stating that any subunit of a regional school district that met certain maximum population and tax-based requirements could choose to form its own school district. The ensuing litigation revolved around the question of whether the new statute was still singling out the Satmars for favor, but just concealing its favoritism behind a false veneer of neutral criteria. If it was, then under the court's announced principle that it's unconstitutional to only grant one religious community the right to have its own school district, the new statute would be found unconstitutional. On the other hand, if other communities besides Kiryas Joel could satisfy the at least facially neutral criteria, which would prove that the Satmars weren't being singled out, that would raise the chilling specter, chilling to liberal integrationists, that is, of wealthy white communities withdrawing from socioeconomically mixed regional school districts and forming their own separate school districts. For folks like Louis Grummet and others of his ilk, this was the nightmare scenario, that the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Establishment Clause as imposing a no singling out requirement, rather than a no separatist school districts requirement, would go hand in hand with the facilitation of racial and socioeconomic residential and school segregation. That principle went a long way toward satisfying Christian and other religious conservatives who wanted to put an end to the principle of strict separation. But it didn't go all the way. It did not amount to a full-scale dismantling of the wall of separation idea that Chief Justice Rehnquist had called for in 1985, and that conservative Christian organizations had hoped the court would issue in the Grummet case. Newly formed Christian advocacy organizations like the American Center for Law and Justice, or the ACLJ, which was established by Pat Robertson in 1990, just as this case was beginning, and was led for decades by Jay Sekulow, a Messianic Jew and conservative media personality who today is best known as President Trump's personal lawyer, had seen in the plight of the Satmar children with special needs a sympathetic case that might finally persuade the court, presided over now by Justice Rehnquist, to overturn its decisions declaring public support for religious education to be unconstitutional and more generally to repudiate the principle of separation between church and state. Sekulow had just scored the religious right's first legal victory in a case requiring school districts that allow community groups to use public school facilities after hours to grant the same opportunity to religious groups. And he would go on to have a hand, either as lead attorney or as a writer of influential amicus briefs, such as the one that he filed on behalf of the ACLJ in the case against the Kiryas Joel School District, in virtually every significant free exercise and Establishment Clause case, and many free speech cases as well, which have collectively shifted the court's interpretation of the First Amendment dramatically to the right. Now, at the same time that this high-profile litigation was taking place, the Satmars were becoming embroiled in other lawsuits that thrust them into the jurisdiction of secular courts. As early as the late 1980s, the circle of supporters clustered around the late Rebbe's wife had initiated court proceedings designed to establish title and control over valuable real estate assets in both Brooklyn and Kiryas Joel as part of this burgeoning succession battle that David discussed. The Satmar establishment retaliated by expelling them from the congregation, denying them access to the cemetery, and suing them for wrongfully conveying title to properties that the congregation claimed rightfully belonged to it. The widow's supporters retaliated in turn by filing lawsuits alleging that they were being subjected to religious discrimination by the Satmar leadership in violation of civil rights ordinances that prohibit denying access to cemeteries on the basis of religion, and claiming that they were being libeled in the Satmar-run Yiddish newspaper. And those lawsuits were just the beginning. As opposition to Moshe and Aaron widened into a full-blown dissident movement inside Kiryas Joel, the conflict intensified, playing out in the streets, as well as in the synagogues and schools, and increasingly in secular courts of law, especially after the school district was established, with which the descendants seized upon as a new basis for grievance, symbolizing the establishment's willingness to, that is to say, the Satmar establishment's willingness to traffic with the secular world. Now, all of this litigation is particularly remarkable because the Satmars profess to adhere to the traditional Jewish principle that internal disputes should never be brought before Gentile courts. And yet that principle was, to put it mildly, honored in the breach over and over again, producing dozens of lawsuits and employing dozens, if not hundreds, of lawyers. Now, I wish I could share some of the details of these lawsuits manifesting the internal controversies and presenting them to the secular courts. Time is too short for that. But what is important to note is that none of these cases resulted in any definitive conclusion of the fundamental issues that were being presented. We never got a definitive adjudication of the particularly provocative claim brought by KJ dissidents who have sued the village over and over again, claiming that it is a theocracy operating in contravention of the Establishment Clause. Nor did we ever get a conclusive ruling on whether the last statute enacted by the New York State Legislature authorizing the Kiryas Joel School District is constitutional, nor a conclusive ruling with regard to the legal issues in the conflict between the Aronis and the Zollis that erupted in the early 2000s and occupied courts in Brooklyn and Orange County for the better part of a decade. That tangled skein of litigation ended in 2008 with a declaration by New York State's highest court that the issues are non-justiciable because they are religious controversies, and long-standing legal doctrine maintains that American courts cannot intervene in religious controversies. And yet, even when the judicial decision was not to decide a case because it's a religious controversy, or as in other cases, to enforce a private settlement entered into by the dissidents that they immediately came to regret, the secular courts have been deeply involved in the Satmar's internal political controversies. And likewise, even when the judges to hear these cases were liberal judges who believed in a wall of separation between religion and state and the value of integration, they rendered decisions, more often than not shadow docket decisions, that had the effect of shoring up one side of the internal disputes against the other and furthering the changes in American legal culture that were supportive of communitarian forms of group empowerment. And with that, And we could go on, but we want to leave time for questions if there are any.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, David and Nomi. This was a very rich presentation, and I'm sure there will be questions. I do have some questions of my own, so why don't I start? And my questions are really for the legal aspect that Nomi was exploring, because right, on the one hand, you emphasize so well the reticence of Orthodox rabbis, or in this case Hasidic rabbis, to encourage, I'm thinking historically really, to encourage or to allow members of their communities to seek legal help from secular courts. But on the other hand, you have the Talmudic principle of Dina de Malchuta Dina, which is so much at work in the case that you're studying, where American legal decisions are going to influence outcomes in Kiryas Joel. I'm curious about how these decisions are serving as precedents for other Jewish or non-Jewish fundamentalist religious communities in the state. So are any of the legal cases that you studied providing ammunition for either other Jewish communities or other religious groups to pursue similar outcomes in the legal sphere?
Mm-hmm. So I think we can use the term precedent in two different senses. In a technical sense, these cases might be precedents in situations involving other insular religious communities that are drawn into legal battles in the courts. But in a wider sense, I mean, I can address that. But I think it's really the David and I have both used the term the imagination, the Satmar cultural imagination, the American political imagination, the role that the Shtetl has played in both the American and the Satmar political imagination. And I talked about the way in which, I specifically talked about how in American conservative circles, the way in which the Shtetl became an emblem for America's supposed commitment to nurturing small, insular, faith-based communities, the idea that that is constitutionally protected. And it wasn't only on the right. There were also versions of that idea that were being adopted by center-left and more left-wing versions of multiculturalism. So I think what is clearly the case is that the village of Kiryas Joel and the litigation that erupted, particularly the high-profile litigation that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, has served as a model, especially for the Christian right? So you see in popular literature, some of you might be familiar with the book written by Rod Dreher called The Benedict Option. And he has a chapter basically saying, look at what these, Hasidic Jewish communities have done. They have formed their own villages, that separate and withdraw from the outside world. That's what we conservative Christians need to do. So undoubtedly, it has had precedential value in that sort of diffuse cultural sense. The way in which that case and other cases that I didn't get to describe have precedential effects is more complicated, and to a certain extent limited by the fact that, as I said, by virtue of a variety of different legal procedures, many of the cases avoided issuing any definitive ruling of the core issues, such as, is Kiryas Joel a theocracy in contravention of the Establishment Clause? So in that sense, we really did not get precedents that can be applied in a technical sense, either to support or to thwart similar separatist endeavors of other communities.
Yeah, I'll just say a word about what is new here in the case of Kiryas Joel and the Satmar Hasidic group. That is to say, over and against earlier patterns of political and legal behavior. So certainly legal pluralism, appealing to multiple legal fora, jurisdictions, is not new to the Satmar Hasidim. There's a burgeoning body of scholarship that looks at Jewish legal pluralism, the ways in which Jews appealed not only to rabbinical courts, but to Islamic courts, colonial courts, simultaneously or concurrently. What is and what's not new here is adherence to the principle of dina di malchuta dina, the law of the kingdom is the law, the ancient principle that sort of regulates the relationship between a sovereign regime and the Jewish community. What is new here, it seems, is are two things, really. The sense, frankly, of entitlement, the sense of Satmar Hasidim that we have a right to make use of the instrumentalities of power, legal and political, in ways that our forebears perhaps did not feel. This, I think, has a lot to do with surviving the Holocaust, and it has a lot to do with the Satmar view that the United States is indeed a Malchus Shel Chesed, is a kingdom of grace, distinct from other sites where Jews and Hasidic Jews, and Satmar Hasidic Jews in particular, lived previously. Although there is a great deal of attachment to the ideal of Hungary in the Satmar cultural imagination. But there is this sense of entitlement, and there is a tremendous amount of sophistication in making use of those legal and political instruments of power. And that seems to be new and different, at least as a matter of degree, if not kind, from earlier Hasidic or Haredi political behavior. It has, reached the point that, as Nomi just said, it's become, in some sense, an ideal for other groups to follow, particularly the political model of creating this form of local sovereignty that Kiryas Joel represents.
Thank you so much. We have a question in the chat from Ada Haas. Should I read it? Maybe I'll read it for you. How do you compare the view of the Satmar separatism to that accorded the Amish, for example?
Mm-hmm. So it's a good question because there are some striking similarities between these communities. There used to be a quip. I think it was in the 90s. There were a bunch of movies, both about the Amish and then about Hasidic communities, and it became a quip to refer to Hasidim as the Jewish Amish, and that's mainly because they share, Christian and Jewish versions of a similar theology, of a theology of separatism, of withdrawal from worldly affairs, of as Rod Dreher puts it, a version of the Benedict option. And they're communities that cling to traditional sartorial norms, although the Satmars are certainly far more deviated from 18th century garb than the Amish are, and above all, that continue to, the mother tongue, and for many people, the only tongue, is for the Satmars Yiddish, and for Mennonites and the Amish and other Mennonite communities, a pretty archaic version of German. And there was a very notable Supreme Court case, one of the most significant cases in the canon of free exercise clause jurisprudence. That's the other clause in the First Amendment, in addition to the Establishment Clause, that addresses the relationship or the position of religion vis-a-vis the state. And in that case, in the early 1970s, right, in this period, this formative period for Kiryas Joel, the Supreme Court handed down a decision saying that the Amish had the right to an exemption from state compulsory education laws. The Amish had gone to court saying that while they didn't object to complying with compulsory education law up until the 8th grade, after that, it would be inimical to their way of life. It would indeed be a threat to their traditional way of religious life if their children were required to attend school of any kind, private, public, what have you. And that was really one of the very first religious exemption cases. But a key difference between the Amish and the Satmars is the Amish did not form their own municipal institutions. They didn't form their own villages or towns. They didn't form their own public school districts. They don't have their own public housing authorities. These are all political institutions, right? That exercise the delegated powers of the state. And that is what is such a dramatic feature and a feature of Kiryas Joel that really distinguishes it from other separatist, insular, traditionalist religious communities like the Amish.
Yeah, I want to just jump in and sort of highlight the juxtaposition between the Amish and the Satmar Hasidim, and then add a third model of sort of educational organization. So the guiding court case, as Nomi suggested, Yoder v. Wisconsin, 1972, basically allowed the Amish to pull their kids out of public schools. The guiding Supreme Court case in the case of the Satmar Hasidim was Grummet v. School Board of the Free Union District of Kiryas Joel, which which basically created a pathway toward the establishment of a self-standing public school district within this entirely Satmar town. So that's a real clear case of using the instrumentalities of power, legal and political, to create basically a state institution within this religious enclave. Very different from the opting out practice of the Amish, who did not want to use the instrumentalities of the state to create their own school. They wanted to sort of be liberated from the constraints of a public school education. There's a third model that people often are interested in and sometimes confused with Kiryas Joel because it involves Orthodox and Haredi Jews, and that's the case of, say, East Ramapo, New York, the East Ramapo School District. East Ramapo is a school district that whose students contain very few, if any, Orthodox or Haredi kids, though the school board has been, at various points of time, controlled by Orthodox and Haredi school board members who have altered the way in which the budget is allocated, making sure that significantly more resources are directed towards the private schools, particularly the yeshivas and cheders, in East Ramapo, that fall within the catchment area of the East Ramapo School District. That's a third model, not the creation of a self-standing public school within a monolithic, homogeneous Hasidic or Haredi village, but taking control of the resources and instruments of power in a non-Orthodox, non-Haredi entity for the benefits of serving the private school kids. And it should be noted that school districts are required, the state is required to provide transportation as well as remedial education for private school kids. So it's not as if there's a complete disconnect between a school district serving public school kids and kids who attend private schools within that district. But the East Ramapo version is a quite different model from Kiryas Joel on one hand and the Amish in the case of Yoder on the other.
There is to that a note in the chat from Ilan Sandberg mentioning that the documentary City of Joel mentions that the non-Haredi residents zoned for the Ramapo school were infuriated by what
not so much by the
Satmar did to
Satmars,
the
but by
school.
not so much by the Satmars, but by the other Orthodox and Haredi members of the school board. It was perceived by many as a complete takeover and a defunding of the public schools within the East Ramapo School District, and generated very considerable tensions. We see similar kinds of tensions emerging in a similar case in Lakewood, New Jersey, not so much in terms of the school board, but just in terms of the operation of the city as a whole. Again, very different from the case of Kiryas Joel, which is a de novo creation intended exclusively for the Satmar community. Lakewood was a resort town in New Jersey that began after Rabbi Aaron Cutler established their what has come to be one of the largest yeshivas in the world, the Beit Midrash Gavoa in Lakewood, 1943. From that time, there's been a substantial influx of Orthodox and Haredi Jews who now represent a majority of the residents and are now demanding that their proclivities and interests and budgetary desires be reflected in the management of the city. That has become another battleground, in a sense, between Haredi Jews and non-Haredi Jews, including other Jews and non-Jews in general.
Mm-hmm. And I think these cases, in the juxtaposition of the controversy over the East Ramapo School District with the Kiryas Joel School District, they point our attention to a pair of interrelated questions. The first of these interrelated questions is, I think, oft posed, which is, what are the obligations that the Satmars or other Hasidic communities or other insular separatist religious communities have to others? What obligations do they owe others? And the criticism of what happened in East Ramapo is rightfully motivated by the perception of indifference to other communities, particularly those who attend the public school districts, who attend the public schools that are run by the public school district in East Ramapo or wherever the school district happens to be. So that's a very legitimate question. Don't members of religious insular communities have obligations to others? But there's another question that doesn't get posed, and I think it needs to be posed alongside that, which is what is the obligation that other communities have to these insular communities? And in this context specifically, are children from these communities who have special needs obligated to attend public schools? It's a deep-seated principle of American law that education can be compulsory, but public education is not compulsory, that parents have the right to choose to send their children to religious schools, private schools, religious or non-religious, instead. But are we saying that only holds for children who don't have special needs? I mean, there's something a little perverse about saying children with special needs and only children with special needs are obligated to attend public schools because that is the only way in which publicly funded special education services or other kinds of therapeutic services or remedial education services can be delivered. And the takeover was motivated by the perception that was not entirely ill-founded that, as happened in the events leading up to the formation of the public school district in Kiryas Joel, that the existing school districts were not sufficiently sensitive to legitimate claims about circumstances in which the educational program that was best tailored to a child with special needs would have brought the services to the child in the religious schools. So there's a question of mutual obligation that I think we have yet to really confront in a fully reciprocal way.
Before addressing Elon's question, I do want to just add one other piece that and highlight an argument in the book, which is the idea of liberal illiberalism that informs Kiryas Joel. And that is to say, Kiryas Joel is a decidedly illiberal community. It's not a community that values the principle of personal autonomy or choice. It's a community that values obligation and responsibility and adherence to the norms of the community as paramount considerations. Interestingly, some might say paradoxically, the success of that illiberal community has been enabled by the American liberal system in several regards. First, in the economic sense, the purchase of private property is really the foundation of all of these examples of religious communitarianism that we talk about. But it's also the franchise, the right to vote, that allowed for a private community of property owners to create basically an illiberal Hasidic public square. This notion of illiberal, I don't think would be contested. It's not meant as a term of opprobrium, but rather as a descriptive term. And therein lies, it seems, one of the tension points, paradoxes of American liberalism that political theorists and philosophers have long vexed over. The fact that it can enable and empower decidedly illiberal subcommunities from taking rise and succeeding. And we might say, at one level, as we looked at that slide that included the most successful example of liberal illiberalism, the state of Utah, really the largest form of religious communitarianism in the United States that we can think of, but extending up to the mid-1980s, when we had a group of followers of an Indian guru establish a city in rural Oregon called Rajneeshpuram. So this practice of liberalism has been very much a part of the landscape of America and really enabled by American liberalism in many respects. And we might say that's good that the liberal order can tolerate these limit cases. We have been asking ourselves, really, in the wake of January 6th, whether, as we witness the deterioration of the institutions of democracy in this country, whether that model is sustainable, whether that model can really enable the American democratic order to survive. That model of separatism, of proud illiberalism, that in some ways grates against core civic values, can continue to exist. And we wonder, whether there needs to be an adjustment in sort of the balancing of liberal and illiberal sensibilities in communities such as Kiryas Joel. Whether, and one way in which this can be recalibrated is in just insisting on a much higher degree of education in shared civic values or in core civic values, in the very core concepts of democracy, which in the American case, which are not part of the typical education, certainly of Satmar boys. Girls are exposed to a much larger diet of secular subjects and have a bit more access to these ideas. But this is a question that we ask ourselves when we think of the liberal illiberalism that has been so successful in allowing KJ to achieve its success.
There is a follow-up note from Ilan Sandberg. I think you may have addressed it, but if there's anything else, he's asking, children in schools do need to attain a sufficient level of secular knowledge, even if private or homeschooled. If there's anything else, David and Nomi, that you'd like to add.
Well, there's a huge battle brewing in the state of New York between advocates of the idea that all children in the state of New York, those who attend public school and those who attend private school, should be required to achieve a minimal standard of literacy, not just in the English language, but in core subjects. And in particular, this relates to the demand that private school children meet the substantial equivalency requirement, as it's known, that insists that they achieve comparable levels of knowledge in a host of subjects to those of kids in public schools. Notably, some of the most prominent activists in this movement insisting on raising the level of secular studies in the private schools of New York, and particularly the Haredi schools, are former Haredim, are those who have left the Haredi fold. On the other side, we have the communities themselves, the national, international Haredi organization, Agudat Yisrael, the Aguda, the Catholic Church, and a number of other Christian conservative activists, arrayed on the other side, saying schools in the private sector should be allowed to basically teach kids what they feel is most important to be taught. And they've been pushing back against the insistence that private schools meet the substantial equivalency requirement.
Which is to say that the proposition Elon formulated, up until now, it was an uncontroversial, unchallenged proposition that all schools have to meet certain minimum standards of secular education, including all private schools, religious or otherwise, and homeschools. The problem that first motivated the litigation and the political battle that David just talked about was that those were laws on the book, but they were under-enforced if they were enforced at all. In other words, the state had those laws, had those requirements, but it wasn't enforcing them against the yeshivas. And people who were products of a yeshiva education and then left the community feel like they were deprived of their right to secular education, and they've been suing the state for having failed to enforce its own laws guaranteeing that right. But now we're moving away. Now the question is not just a question of under enforcement of those laws, but whether those laws are legitimate at all. And you see, this has unsurprisingly become a cause towards which the homeschooling movement and the Christian right more generally has gravitated to support the yeshivas in demanding, in pushing not just pushing back against the enforcement of the laws guaranteeing minimum standards of secular education, but challenging the very idea that the state has the authority to impose such standards. And, that's a new frontier. And that's how far we have gone in terms of embracing a conception of religious liberty seemingly without limits.
Yeah, I'll just add one sort of contextual strand to the picture. So we understand that Kiryas Joel is not an outlier in the history of religious communities in the United States at all. That's been a central point, but I want to sort of give one other example of that. So Kiryas Joel is officially incorporated in 1977. 2 years later, a movement called the Moral Majority takes rise. The Moral Majority, founded by Jerry Falwell, plays a very important role in the 1980 presidential election, and is deeply committed to the principle that religion deserves a much more prominent place in the American public square. And the Moral Majority, for the period it existed, and then subsequent institutions and actors after, continued in that direction to push toward a greater role for religion, religious actors, religious themes in the public square. Kiryas Joel is part of that arc of historical development, very much part of the arc, and seen as a source of inspiration for Christian conservatives. The way that arc has bent at present is toward this quite remarkable insistence on the primacy of religious liberties, as Nomi just mentioned, as if that is the paramount, the ascendant liberty or right granted to citizens of the United States, such that some would suggest that principle overrides the requirement or demands of state actors to assure public health. Indeed, we saw a clash between those principles, principle of religious liberties and the state's interest in guaranteeing public health in the COVID crisis, in a variety of different religious communities, including the Haredi communities of New York. So we're really trying to situate the story of Kiryas Joel in that larger arc of the history of the United States, where we see this quite astonishing entwining of religious and political interests. And as Chief Justice Rehnquist called for, the utter dismantling of the wall of separation, the famous Jeffersonian wall of separation between church and state.
We have one more question from Philip Barnett, who is curious about the 1%.
1%.
Yes, who are not Satmar. Who are they and why do they live there?
Yeah, well, they're people who, they're a very small number of people. Oftentimes, they can be child care providers for large Satmar families. They can also be
live-in domestic.
Live-in domestic, yeah. Live-in domestic, oftentimes from foreign countries, Eastern Europe. That has been a sort of a historical tradition in the community, as well as workers at a number of commercial establishments in town, especially in the grocery markets.
But that was short-lived, I think, right? There was for a period of time a sort of camp of workers in the poultry. One of the larger businesses, and there was for a brief period of time sort of residential quarters for, I think, primarily Latino workers, but that disbanded long ago.
There still are some working, not so much in the poultry. One of the main businesses in town is the poultry plant, living in the community and working in the grocery markets of the community. So very small number. It's interesting to ask whether Kiryas Joel, because of its attraction as a place at a remove from the city, and because of the richness of its institutions and commercial establishments, and as it continues to grow, will become a source of attraction for other traditionally observant Jews who will see it as a kind of model in terms of the services that it can provide. That, I think, has to be factored into demographic projections about the growth of the community, not just internal Satmar growth, but other Haredi Jews coming to Kiryas Joel over the next 50 years as it transforms into the first Haredi city in the United States.
But I'll just add, I think it bears mention, even though this goes back to sort of the origin story in the 1970s, that when the boundary line around the village of Kiryas Joel was first drawn, and remember that was sort of the product of a deal, really, that was brokered between the leaders of the Satmars and the leaders of the town of Monroe. Originally, there were some non-Satmar residents, properties in the town of Monroe that were contained within the proposed boundary line for the village. And they strenuously objected to being contained in the village and demanded that the boundary line be drawn out. So the exclusionary nature, or the, that astonishing figure, like nearly 100%, is a product not only of the Satmar's desire to separate from everyone else, but everybody else's desire to be separated from them. So again, I think it's always important to look at both sides of this exclusionary boundary line and remember that the desire to exclude exists on both sides.
We only have just a few minutes left, but I had one final question coming to it from European early modern history. This is such an American Jewish history story. But at the same time, I wonder the extent to which the Satmar Hasidic leaders are envisioning their village and now town as a nostalgic iteration of something that existed in their mind in Europe in the olden days, right? So, because this reminds on a superficial level of the corporate early modern community before the rise of the modern state and all the battles that you've been talking about around education and Jewish schools are also battles that we can study when we look at the late 18th century, moving into the 19th century and the state intervening. But clearly that is a different story. But I do wonder the degree to which there's a level of nostalgia in the imagination of Satmar leaders in envisioning this new project that they're building in upstate New York.
Tremendous amount of nostalgia. I mean, we begin the book by juxtapositioning two traditionalist communities. The sort of neo-colonial Woodbury Commons, one of the most popular mega malls in the state of New York, and Kiryas Joel, a mere 3 or 4 miles away, both of which sort of hark back to older traditions. But what we're struck by, and there's a tremendous amount of nostalgia in the Satmar community for the old country and particularly for Hungary, so for pre-Romanian Hungary, sort of the imperial kingdom of Hungary. But as we note, in borrowing from Habsburg Ranger, this is an invented tradition because Reb Yoelish and his followers imagined the recreation of a Shtetl in Satmar that never existed. Satmar Satumare was always a multicultural, multilingual, East Central European city of which the Jews comprised about 1/4 of the population. So in thinking back, so there's a tremendous amount of imagination of what the Hungarian Shtetl, sort of the Haredi Hungarian Shtetl was, and even a sense that we have replicated and even perfected it, but this is a novelty of America, of the United States, hence American Shtetl.
Our time is up. There's one last note from Ilan Sandberg in the chat. Just a note in case it interests anyone. There's a publication in Israel, Tzarech Iyun, published by Haredis, with articles written by Haredis for a Haredi audience that deals with the issue of balancing community isolation and contribution to the country at large. Not important, just in case someone is interested. You may be familiar with that.
Ilan, it's important. It's important, and it's there's very interesting perspectives in Tzarech Iyun. Thank you for bringing it to our attention.
I just want to end by thanking you again for this very rich, fascinating presentation. This was wonderful. For those of you who are still here, I just want to remind you that Princeton University Press offers 30% off American Shtetl with a code that I'm going to post right now in the chat. So go and buy the book, buy directly from the press. I think they also offer free shipping. Thank you again, Nomi and David. This was wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Just one final reminder, the next co-sponsored event of the Center for Jewish Studies takes place May 12th at 12 p.m. It is in support of Ukrainian scholars, poets, and journalists. And if you subscribe to our mailing list, you'll receive information very shortly. Thanks again. This was wonderful and great to see you both.
Thank you, Francesca.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.